A deafening silence swept through the marble courthouse as Judge Caroline Mercer's gavel crashed down, the sound reverberating like thunder. Under stormy evening skies in Washington, the world held its breath. Thomas Reed, a 34-year-old male attorney with sharp features and haunted eyes, stood frozen at the defense table, his heart pounding, knuckles white against polished wood. Beside him sat his client, a frail, terrified whistleblower in her late 20s, clutching a worn notebook, eyes wide with fear and hope. The government prosecutor, cold and deliberate, announced, "This is not an ordinary case, Your Honor." Flashbulbs exploded from the press benches. A lone woman in the gallery stifled a sob. Thomas recalled his father's voice in his memory. "Never look away from the truth, son." Across the aisle, senior government lawyers, gray-haired and confident, whispered and exchanged knowing glances. Judge Mercer stared down, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Reed, the nation is watching. You have one chance to make your case." Thomas's lips parted, words trembling at the edge, as he weighed the consequences of every choice. The atmosphere was electric, thick with tension, every soul waiting for the first word that might change everything. As the echo of the gavel faded, the courtroom drew a collective breath, every face taut with anticipation. Thomas Reed's mind spun with fragments of memory, law, and desperation. He looked to his client, her knuckles white around the battered notebook, and saw both terror and trust in her gaze. Thomas said, "We are not here to topple the government. We are here because the truth was buried and the law demands we dig it out." Judge Mercer met his eyes, searching for weakness. In the jury box, men and women shifted, their lives interrupted by the weight of this moment. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering above paper. The prosecutor smirked, tapping his folder impatiently. Rain hammered the windows. Thomas's voice, low but unwavering, pressed on. "We are not asking for sympathy, only justice." The tension in the room was so thick it felt suffocating, hope and dread swirling. His client nodded, tears brimming but unshed. Every moment pulsed with risk, the line between ruin and redemption thinner than glass. Outside, thunder rolled as the prosecution rose, a cold smile on his lips. "This whistleblower," he declared, "violated national security and betrayed public trust." The gallery stirred, some with anger, others with doubt. Thomas felt every eye on him, the burden nearly crushing. But as the prosecutor paced, Thomas's resolve grew. He recalled long nights preparing, the stakes mounting with each document uncovered. The judge's gavel tapped softly, reminding all of the gravity. The whistleblower squeezed Thomas's arm, whispering, "Don't let them break us." He nodded, drawing strength from her courage. Every law book and late-night conversation with his mentor rushed to mind. He said, "Every right worth defending is a risk worth taking." His voice was calm, but steel ran through his words. The prosecutor turned, eyes glinting. Tension spiraled, each side waiting for the next blow, knowing reputations and futures balanced on the razor's edge. Judge Mercer's voice sliced through the tension. "This court will hear evidence but not intimidation," she announced, her words chilling and precise. The air shifted, even the most hardened lawyers straightened in their seats. Thomas nodded respectfully, sensing a sliver of hope. The prosecutor scowled, but held his tongue. Journalists scribbled furiously, their eyes darting between judge, defendant, and counsel. The whistleblower's hands trembled, but she sat a little taller, emboldened by the judge's clarity. Thomas felt resolve surge inside him. "We have evidence that speaks for itself," he stated. The judge gestured for proceedings to continue, her gaze never wavering. Rain intensified, pounding the windows with relentless force. The moment crackled with potential. Every word, every movement, every glance seemed charged with meaning. The drama was just beginning, and no one in the courtroom would ever be the same. As the first witness was sworn in, Thomas leaned close to his client. "Remember, the truth is our shield," he whispered. She nodded, voice trembling as she replied, "I'm ready." The bailiff's voice boomed, breaking the spell. The prosecutor approached the stand, questions sharp as knives. Thomas's notes were organized, each fact a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. He watched the jury, reading every twitch, every furrowed brow. His mind raced. What traps were hidden in the prosecution's case? What secrets could topple their story? The air felt thick with destiny, every word and gesture weighing more than ever before. Thomas inhaled deeply, determination hardening his features. He knew this was the moment to turn the tide. The game had begun, and there would be no second chances. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of unease as Thomas Reed approached the witness stand. His eyes scanned the jury, gauging their reactions, searching for a flicker of doubt in their hardened gazes. His voice was steady but charged with purpose. "We are here to expose a truth hidden behind closed doors." The whistleblower, a slender woman in her late 20s, clutched the Bible as she was sworn in. Her hands trembled, but her eyes shone with fierce resolve. Outside, rain battered the courthouse windows, casting a rhythmic beat to the tense atmosphere inside. Thomas began his questioning carefully, each word chosen to chip away at the government's ironclad narrative. The prosecutor's gaze never wavered, cold and calculating, prepared to pounce. But the witness's testimony was a fragile thread, weaving a story of betrayal, secrets, and courage. The courtroom held its breath, caught in the fragile dance of truth and power. The stakes had never been higher. Thomas's questioning deepened, probing the government's cover-up with precision and care. "What did you see that night?" he asked softly. The witness swallowed, voice steady despite the weight. "Documents. Files they didn't want anyone to find." The courtroom seemed to lean in closer, the air thick with suspense. The prosecutor's smirk tightened. He stepped forward, ready to attack. Thomas met his gaze unflinchingly, knowing the cross-examination would be merciless. Outside, dark clouds churned, thunder rolling low and distant. The whistleblower's bravery seemed to infect the room, a fragile hope against overwhelming odds. Every sentence was a battle, every fact a weapon. Thomas felt the pressure mount but refused to falter. This was more than a case. It was a fight for justice itself. The prosecutor launched his assault, voice sharp and biting. "You claim there was a cover-up, but where is the proof? Mere allegations won't sway this court." His words cut through the tension, met with a ripple of murmurs. Thomas's jaw clenched, but he remained composed, stepping up with a folder of evidence. "These documents," he said, "were hidden deliberately, a fact this court must consider." The judge's eyes narrowed, signaling the battle's intensity. The whistleblower's hands clenched in her lap, her courage unwavering. Outside, lightning illuminated the darkening sky, casting fleeting shadows across the courthouse. The courtroom's pulse quickened. The truth was no longer a whispered secret, but a thunderous call to justice. Thomas felt the tide turning, but knew the fight was far from over. Judge Mercer's voice rang clear, commanding silence and attention. "The court acknowledges the introduction of these documents. Let the record show they will be examined thoroughly." A hush fell over the room, the weight of justice settling like dust. Thomas exchanged a brief glance with his client, relief mingled with anticipation. The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line, his confidence flickering. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming on the courthouse roof with relentless rhythm. Thomas knew this was a small victory, but the war was just beginning. Every piece of evidence, every testimony would be dissected and challenged. The courtroom was a battlefield, and the law their weapon. He steeled himself for the coming storm, aware that the truth was both fragile and fierce. As the day wore on, Thomas and his team reviewed evidence in hushed conference rooms, strategy and doubt entwined. The whistleblower's courage was a beacon amid shadows of fear. "They want to silence you," Thomas said quietly, "but truth is louder than threats." Her eyes flickered with fear and determination. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution prepared their counterattack, armed with witnesses and legal maneuvers, designed to undermine every claim. Thomas's mind raced, knowing the path ahead would test every ounce of resolve and skill. Outside, The storm showed no sign of relenting, as if nature itself echoed the relentless battle unfolding inside. The fight for justice was far from over. It was just beginning. The courtroom atmosphere thickened as Thomas Reed rose once again, a storm of thoughts behind his calm exterior. "Justice demands transparency, not silence," he declared, voice resonant with conviction. His gaze locked with the jury, hoping to ignite a spark of doubt about the government's narrative. The whistleblower sat close, her eyes steady despite the rising tension. The prosecution countered swiftly, painting Thomas as a reckless idealist. Outside, twilight dimmed the courthouse windows, shadows lengthening across polished wood. Every word exchanged was a calculated move in a deadly game of legal chess. Thomas's mind raced, aware that every second could tip the scales. The courtroom held its breath, caught in a fragile balance between truth and power. Thomas leaned forward, voice steady but urgent. The documents reveal not just negligence, but a deliberate effort to conceal vital information from the public. He spread evidence across the table, photographs, emails, memos. The judge's eyes narrowed, the jury shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor's counterattack was relentless, sowing doubt with pointed questions. Yet, the witness remained resolute, her testimony unwavering. Outside, rain returned, tapping insistently on the courthouse roof, as if mirroring the relentless scrutiny inside. Thomas felt the weight of every gaze, every doubt. But his resolve hardened. He knew the fight was no longer just about facts, but about exposing a system determined to protect itself at all costs. The prosecutor's tone grew harsher, voice rising. "Accusations without irrefutable proof are dangerous. Are we to convict on speculation?" Murmurs rose from the audience. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he stayed composed. "Truth often begins as a whisper before it becomes a roar," he replied. The judge's gaze sharpened, calling for order. The whistleblower glanced nervously at Thomas, who gave a reassuring nod. Outside, flashes of lightning lit the sky, casting stark shadows inside. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, each heartbeat echoing louder. Thomas knew the trial was not just legal, it was a battle for conscience, with the scales of justice trembling under the weight of power and secrecy. Judge Mercer's voice cut through the rising tension like steel. "This court will not be swayed by theatrics. Evidence will guide our judgment." Her words fell heavy, demanding silence and respect. Thomas inhaled deeply, knowing the next phase was critical. The whistleblower's testimony was the fragile keystone holding their case together. Outside, the storm raged, thunder rolling over the city. The courtroom's faces reflected a mix of fatigue, determination, and unease. Thomas's eyes met his client's. In that glance, a silent promise to fight with every breath. The battle was far from over, but the first cracks in the government's armor had begun to show. The path ahead was dark and treacherous, but Thomas would not yield. That evening, in a quiet conference room away from prying eyes, Thomas and his client pored over every piece of evidence once more. "They'll try to break us, but truth is relentless," he said softly. Her gaze was fierce despite exhaustion. Plans were made, strategies honed for the battles yet to come. Outside, the storm's fury gradually softened to a steady drizzle, mirroring a fragile hope blooming amid uncertainty. Thomas knew the courtroom was a battleground, but here, in these moments of quiet resolve, their real fight took shape. Justice was elusive, but not impossible. Together, they prepared to face the darkness, armed with nothing but courage and truth. The courtroom fell into a tense hush as the doors creaked open, revealing a figure no one expected, the missing witness. A man in his early 40s, rugged and unshaven, eyes fierce but weary, stepped forward. Thomas's heart pounded as the judge called for order. The witness cleared his throat, voice low but steady. "I have information that changes everything." Gasps rippled through the room. Even the prosecution faltered, blinking in disbelief. The whistleblower's grip tightened on her notebook, hope flickering anew. Outside, storm clouds thickened, thunder rumbling as if echoing the seismic shift inside. This revelation was a fulcrum, threatening to topple the carefully constructed facade of government innocence. Thomas met the witness gaze, knowing the truth was about to explode into the open, rewriting the story forever. The witness began recounting hidden meetings, secret documents exchanged in shadows. His voice was gravelly, but his testimony pierced the courtroom like a blade. Thomas leaned in, absorbing every word as the prosecution's confident veneer cracked. The judge scribbled notes, eyes narrowing with skepticism and curiosity. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The scale of the scandal was growing monstrous. Outside, rain pounded harder, streaking windows with relentless fury. The whistleblower wiped a tear, her courage magnified by the witness' bravery. Thomas whispered under his breath, "This is what we needed, the truth, raw and unfiltered." But the prosecution was already gathering strength, ready to counterattack with all the ferocity of a cornered beast. The prosecutor's voice rose like a whip, slicing through the courtroom tension. "This man's testimony is hearsay, riddled with inconsistencies and motives to deceive." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs and raised eyebrows. Thomas stood, voice steady but fierce. "Every word he speaks is backed by documents we have secured. The government's effort to silence him won't stand." The judge's gaze was piercing, weighing every argument. The whistleblower's fingers clenched the edge of her seat, anticipation mounting. Outside, lightning cracked the sky open, shadows dancing across the courthouse walls. The courtroom had become a battleground where truth and power clashed in a high-stakes war, every word threatening to change lives forever. Judge Mercer's voice sliced through the chaos. "Enough! This court demands order and respect. All evidence will be scrutinized with impartiality." The room stilled. Even the most restless jurors settled into silence. Thomas's eyes met his client's, the unspoken promise of unwavering defense passing between them. Outside, the storm began to relent, soft rain pattering against stone. Yet inside, the tempest raged on, fueled by secrets unearthed and alliances tested. Thomas felt the weight of the moment. The truth was no longer hidden but exposed, raw and dangerous. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, but a crucible where the fate of justice would be forged, under fire and pressure. In the quiet after the storm, Thomas and the whistleblower retreated to a small office behind the courthouse. The air was thick with exhaustion and resolve. "We've shattered their facade, but the real fight begins now," Thomas said softly. She nodded, tears of relief and fear mingling. Plans were laid for the next day's revelations, new evidence to unleash, truths to expose. Outside, the city breathed beneath a clearing sky, lights flickering like distant stars. Thomas looked out the window, knowing this fight would leave scars but also forge change. The courtroom battles would rage on, but here in these quiet moments, the true strength of justice was born, a fragile hope standing firm against overwhelming odds. The courtroom buzzed with an electric tension as closing arguments began. Thomas Reed stood, calm but fierce, his voice carrying the weight of truth and justice. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is not merely about documents or policies. It is about the very soul of our democracy." His gaze swept the room, settling on the jury with unwavering resolve. "We have uncovered a deliberate campaign to silence those who dared speak out, to bury inconvenient truths beneath layers of deceit." The whistleblower sat close by, her eyes reflecting quiet strength. The prosecution's team exchanged anxious glances, their confidence visibly shaken. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows, a stark contrast to the brightness of hope in the room. Thomas's words reverberated with a promise: justice must prevail, no matter the cost. The lead prosecutor rose next, his tone sharp and urgent. "This case rests on fragile testimony and unverified claims." He paced slowly, eyes flicking to jurors. "We must not allow emotion to cloud reason. To convict without concrete proof is to betray the very principles of justice." The courtroom held its breath as his words sliced through the tension like a cold blade. Thomas met his gaze with quiet defiance, silently vowing to dismantle every doubt. The whistleblower's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face pale but resolute. Outside, clouds darkened once more, thunder rolling low as if warning of the storm to come. Every word, every glance in that room carried the weight of futures hanging in the balance. Thomas returned to his seat, heart pounding but face composed. He whispered to his client, "No matter what happens, your courage has changed this fight." The jury sat, rapt and visibly moved by the closing arguments. The judge's expression remained unreadable, a sentinel of impartiality. Outside, dusk began to settle, and the storm finally broke, rain pattering rhythmically against the courthouse windows. The tension was suffocating, a fragile silence waiting to be shattered by the verdict. Thomas looked around the room, catching fleeting expressions of hope, doubt, fear, and determination. The final moments of the trial had arrived, and with them, the fate of justice itself. The jury filed out to deliberate, the heavy doors closing with a resonant thud that echoed like a heartbeat. Thomas and his client exchanged tense glances, each feeling the crushing weight of uncertainty. Outside, the rain fell steadily, drumming a relentless rhythm on the courthouse roof. The courtroom emptied slowly, whispers filling the fading light. Thomas's mind raced through every testimony, every piece of evidence. He paced the empty room, feeling the enormity of the moment. The fight for truth had reached its climax, but the outcome remained unknown. Hope flickered, fragile and fierce, as the storm outside began to wane. Hours later, the jury returned, faces solemn yet resolute. Judge Mercer called the court to order and asked the foreperson to read the verdict. The room fell into a suffocating silence as the words were spoken. "We find the defendant not guilty." Gasps and murmurs erupted, the weight of relief crashing over Thomas and his client. Tears welled in the whistleblower's eyes, her body trembling with exhaustion and triumph. The prosecution sat stunned, their facade cracked but unbroken. Judge Mercer nodded slowly, her expression unreadable but dignified. Outside, the storm had passed, a quiet dawn breaking over the city. Justice had been served, but the battle's scars lingered, a reminder of the price paid for truth. The courtroom emptied slowly, echoes of the verdict fading into the marble halls. Thomas Reed stood alone by the tall windows, rain-soaked streets stretching beyond the cityscape. His thoughts were a whirlwind of relief and apprehension. The victory was monumental, but the cost weighed heavily on him. "Justice," he murmured to himself, "is never without sacrifice." Reporters clamored outside, their flashes illuminating the night. Thomas's client, pale but smiling softly, approached quietly. She said, "We did it, but what now?" He looked out at the darkened streets, shadows of uncertainty lingering. This was just the beginning of a long road toward real change, a fight far beyond the courtroom walls. The night held both promise and peril. In a small, cluttered office, filled with stacks of files and half-empty coffee cups, Thomas and his client reflected on the battle just won. "They'll try to silence us," Thomas said quietly, "but the truth is louder than fear." The whistleblower nodded, eyes tired but determined. Plans for the next steps took shape: public hearings, media interviews, and legal reforms. Outside, the city buzzed with muted excitement, unaware of the storm brewing beneath its surface. Thomas knew the fight was far from over, but hope had taken root. Together, they prepared to face the backlash that awaited, knowing their courage had already sparked a movement. The courtroom victory was just one chapter in a larger story of resistance and resilience. Days later, headlines screamed of government scandal and whistleblower bravery. Thomas watched the media frenzy from a quiet cafe window, cup of coffee cooling untouched. The pressure mounted, threatening phone calls, veiled warnings. But he refused to be intimidated. "They want silence," he thought, "but we have a voice." His client called, voice steady despite the storm of scrutiny around her. They discussed upcoming interviews, public appearances, and the careful balance of exposure and protection. Thomas knew every step forward carried risk, but it also carried the promise of accountability. The courtroom might be behind them, but the public fight had only just begun. Their story was now a beacon for many, a challenge to power itself. One evening, in a quiet park under flickering street lamps, Thomas and his client met with a small group of activists and journalists. Their voices were low but passionate, plans unfolding for rallies and petitions. The whistleblower's eyes shone with newfound strength. Thomas's resolve was unshakable. They spoke of systemic change, transparency, and the power of truth. The city's hum surrounded them, indifferent yet filled with possibility. Thomas knew the path ahead was long and fraught, but the seeds of justice had been sown deep. Together they would nurture that fragile hope, pushing forward even when the darkness threatened to overwhelm. This was more than a victory. It was a call to arms. In the quiet solitude of his apartment, Thomas stared at a framed photo of his father. "You were right," he whispered. "The fight for justice is never easy." His phone buzzed. A message from his client. "We're not done yet." He smiled faintly, heart steady. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Outside, the city lights flickered against the night sky, silent witnesses to the quiet courage of those who dare to speak. Thomas closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. Justice was a journey, and he was just getting started. The sun dipped low behind the city skyline as Thomas Reed walked through the courthouse steps, a quiet resolve etched on his face. Reporters shouted questions, flashes erupting like distant thunder. But he moved with purpose, eyes forward. The weight of the trial still pressed on him, yet beneath it was a flicker of hope. His client, standing nearby, met his gaze with a small, tired smile. "This is just the beginning," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying the promise of more battles to come. The crowd buzzed with whispers of change, a fragile hope spreading like wildfire. The city held its breath, caught between the shadows of the past and the dawn of a new era. Thomas knew the fight would never truly end. But for now, the scales of justice had tipped, if only slightly. In a quiet studio, Thomas sat across from a seasoned journalist, the glow of cameras capturing every word. "What gave you the strength to take on such a powerful government?" the journalist asked. Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't just me. It was every person who believed that truth matters more than fear." His eyes softened as he spoke of his client's bravery and the ripple effect their fight had sparked. Outside, city lights twinkled against the night sky, a backdrop to a story unfolding far beyond the courtroom. The interview was a beacon, a chance to reach those still silenced, and Thomas was determined to use it fully. The struggle for justice was ongoing, but every voice raised made it louder, harder to ignore. Late at night, Thomas and his client met on a quiet rooftop, overlooking the city's sparkling skyline. "We changed something," she whispered, voice filled with awe and exhaustion. Thomas nodded, eyes scanning the horizon, where lights flickered like stars. "But the real work is just beginning." They shared a moment of silence, the city humming below like a living heartbeat. The fight for transparency, for accountability, would stretch far beyond their case. Yet in this rare quiet hope was tangible, a fragile but fierce flame. Thomas felt the burden ease just a little, replaced by a cautious optimism. The night held endless possibilities, and they were ready to face them together. The next morning dawned bright and clear as Thomas stood outside a government building, flanked by a growing crowd of supporters. Voices rose in unison, chants demanding change, justice, and transparency. The media swirled around, capturing the moment that had grown from one courtroom to a movement. Thomas raised his voice, not just as a lawyer, but as a beacon of hope. "This is our moment to hold power accountable," he declared. His client stood beside him, proud and unbowed. The city watched and listened, as the echoes of their fight spread far beyond the courthouse walls. It was a new chapter, one written by those who refused to be silenced, no matter the cost. As the day ended, Thomas sat alone in his office, the city skyline glowing beyond the window. His phone buzzed, a message from his client. "We did it, but the journey continues." He smiled faintly, the weight of victory mingling with the knowledge of battles ahead. He stood, gazing out over the city, the silence around him sharp and profound. Justice was not a destination, but a path walked step by step, with courage and sacrifice. The final breath of the story hung in the air. A quiet resolve, a challenge unanswered, and a promise made in shadows and light. Thomas whispered to the empty room, "This is just the beginning." The city pulsed beneath him, alive with hope and uncertainty.